Okay, everyone, let's start chapter 6. This is the first content of midterm 2, so we'll kind of this will be the lead off. Hopefully everybody did their first midterm and everybody succeeded. Um, I'm recording these in advance, so I'm not entirely sure how everybody did or like what we're still struggling on. So if you there is still content on midterm 1 that you are like, yeah, I have no idea, let me know and we can go back over it and we can do all sorts of things and I can post subsequent lectures, or we can just sit down and have a conversation about everything. But yeah, so this is firms in production. Um, Chapter 6. In this section, we're going to cover six main topics: the ownership and management of a firm. Decisions must be made about how a firm is owned and managed. Production. A firm converts inputs into outputs using one of possibly many available technologies. Short run production. There's going to be one variable and one fixed input. In the short run, only some inputs can be varied, so the firm changes its output by adjusting its variable inputs. When you shift to the long run production, there's two variable inputs. The firm has more flexibility in how everything is produced and how everything changes in the optimal level, in the output level in the long run, excuse me, when all factors can be varied. Then we're going to talk a little bit about returns to scale. So how does the ratio of output to input vary with the size of the firm? Um, Productivity and technical change is the amount of output that can be produced with a given quantity of inputs that varies over time. And so this first one is we're going to talk briefly about ownership and management of firms and production in general. So this is just kind of be a lead off chapter. Um, so we have these two things here, right? We have consumer theory and consumer behavior and producer theory. So consumer behavior or theory of the consumer, as you may hear it, we deal a lot with budgets, right? We have individual budgets, we have preference curves and indifference curves, and all of our optimization is maximizing our utility. And that's because when we're maximizing our utility, we're choosing how to maximize our own preferences and our most well-being. Shifting to producer theory, on the other hand, or theory of the firm, we're dealing less with budgets and more with inputs. And this is because inputs are the things that we can choose. I mean, technically, we're still dealing with budgets, but we're dealing with inputs. And then we're going to deal with some technology and isoquants, which are just kind of the analogous form of indifference curves, but in producer space. And all of our optimization is maximizing profits. And so here, this pi is going to be what we're going to use to denote profit. So this denotes profit. And in short, profit is just our positives minus our negatives, or in this instance, our revenues minus our costs, which we'll get into in a little bit, like 10 minutes or so. And so now we've got this thing called the production process. And the production process has a lot, right? So if we have this black box, let's say that this is our factory, right? There's going to be a lot of inputs that go into the production process and a lot of outputs. Wow, I cannot spell outputs that come out. And so a couple of our inputs would be things like land, right? We have to have a place to work and to grow. It would be labor. We have to have people to work. It would be things like capital. And capital are the buildings, the physical things that we have to make things. And it could also be other things like entrepreneurship, newership, probably misspelled. And these can turn into all sorts of outputs. And these could be things like cars or houses or food or computers. It could even be things like patents and other intellectual property, things like that, right? And so our production process is this is a boiled down production process, but it turns our inputs and things that we can vary, and we're going to look primarily at labor and capital, into tangible outputs that individuals can consume and use. Right. And so now let's think a little bit about like what do firm owners actually want, right? So our firm owners want to maximize revenues minus costs, right? So this is our revenues and these are our costs. And by subtracting revenues minus costs, we make our profit. And so we want to maximize our profit and by having revenues minus costs. And so we have revenues, which are typically just the amount produced times the dollar per unit, right? And then our cost doesn't typically have like it doesn't have a consistent functional form. And our revenue can have like a little bit more complicated functional form too, but for the most part, our revenue looks like P times Q. Our cost, on the other hand, takes in all of those other inputs that we had up here, right? And these are all going to go into a cost function. So land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And all of those are going to interact in different ways. And like, right, like the more labor that you have, maybe the more capital, like the more expensive capital is, or the more capital you have, the more people you need, or costs are a little bit more complicated. And so we're not going to fix a specific functional form at this time. Um, it can really be anything that you want. And so the question is ultimately becomes is like, how do you maximize profits? And it's that you become as efficient as possible. And so what does it mean to be efficient? Well, it means that you cannot produce the current level of output with fewer inputs, and you cannot produce more output with the same inputs, right? And so let's say that we were producing, like we were running a coffee shop and we were making 100 coffees an hour using 3 jugs of milk and a pound of coffee beans. Um, if we were able to produce 100 coffees with 2 gallons of milk instead of three, then we were not operating efficiently to begin with. But at the same time, let's say that we had 3 gallons of milk and our pound of coffee beans. If this can actually make 150 cups of coffee versus 100 cups of coffee, then we were also not operating efficiently because we could have more output with the same amount of inputs. And so there's a couple types of inputs that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at capital, right? So these are long-lived inputs. These are lands, buildings, equipment. Um, Again, these are the like tangibles, if you want to think about it like that. Labor is our hours of work by skilled and unskilled workers. So this could be just anything that anybody would be doing for our company. And then we also have a lot of things like materials, and there's natural resources, raw materials, other materials. There's also things like technology, that technology makes everything a little bit more efficient, right? If we go back to the coffee shop example and we are doing everything in pour overs, but then we get this brand new espresso machine, that is going to improve our production process because we're going to be introduced to a new line of technology. For now, we're going to keep it simple. We're only going to be looking at capital and labor because those are the two that are most important and are most likely to vary in the short and long run. Technological change will typically change the entire market. Um, and so we're going to look at just capital and labor. But there is a couple things that we could attribute to a technological change um, for the most part. And so now we get into this thing called the production function. And a production function is how the firm transforms inputs like labor and capital into the maximum amount of output according to this function, right? And so you're always going to assume that this is the maximum output. Assume that a firm is acting efficiently unless told otherwise, for the most part. That is just kind of a definition that you'll need to know in the real world. But for our intents and purposes in this class, you can just assume that everything is efficient. And remember that our labor and capital are the only inputs that we are going to be looking at, right? We could, in theory, throw things like technology and entrepreneurship in here and land, but we're going to hold all of those constant. And so we're just going to ignore them for now. Well, we're not gonna like we're just not gonna directly um notice them. And so here's where the distinction comes in our production function. In the short run, at least one factor of production cannot be varied. And so typically that's capital, right? So we're going to fix our capital. We can't buy another warehouse in the short run, but what we can do in the short run is we can hire more people. Or in the long run, when we can buy another warehouse and when we can hire more people, we can vary both inputs. And so that's going to be the key distinction in this chapter, is we're going to be looking at the differences between short run production and long run production. And so that's going to wrap up this first video here. This is again, that was just kind of a preliminary video. Hopefully this chapter doesn't seem too daunting. This chapter should be pretty easy. But we'll catch you in the next video to begin our discussion on short run production.